Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our discussion, Coalition Building in Action, Direct Aid. Before we start, we would like to acknowledge that we are but visitors on ancestral, unceded Tongva territory. Many of us who grew up as immigrants in the United States were not taught about the rooted and tenacious Indigenous people whose lands we are occupying and the struggle against systems of oppression that have dispossessed them of their lands and denied their rights to self-determination. All of our struggles, especially with regards to the construct of race, are intertwined. Let us not forget that white supremacists in the 1800s commonly conflated the barbaric, diseased Asian with the indigenous peoples of this country who crossed over from Asia 15,000 years ago. We all have a common enemy to fight. Each of us has internalized white supremacy to a certain extent, and it's our responsibility to collectively and individually rid ourselves of as much of that poison as possible. Demonstrations across the US, which began as eruptions of outrage after the death of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police on May 25th, have cohered into a nationwide and increasingly global movement denouncing racial injustice and demanding accountability for the immeasurable losses sustained by the Black community and the wider BIPOC community at the hands of militarized law enforcement and other expressions of entrenched systemic racism. This outpouring of activism came at a time when the coronavirus pandemic has underscored incredibly deep inequities in society. Despite huge obstacles positioned to keep people complacent and divided, we see multi-ethnic, multi-generational groups of organizers cooperating to take action and make societal change. The Racism is a Public Health Issue webinar that was co-presented with LACMA and SDA in May, the second of which will be 1 week from now on June 23rd, was made up of a panel of cultural producers and scholars addressing the prejudice against Asian Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic. The Q&A box during that presentation was flooded with questions asking, what does solidarity actually look like? The Gyopo team decided it was a good time to put our time and resources into organizing today's Coalition Building in Action, to provide concrete, tangible, human examples of the solidarity and interracial coalition building that are often theorized about. We are thrilled to have this time together to hear about the work of Susan Park, Zarita Jones, Sissy Trin, Roderick Hall, and Steve Diaz, all Los Angeles community organizers who have been working tirelessly before and during the COVID-19 pandemic to provide the most basic and necessary resources to vulnerable populations in our city. There are a few technical things to note before we begin our program. There are captions being generated live. For those who would benefit from reading those, you can turn them on at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Additionally, we have a wonderful ASL interpretation team joining us today. If you would like to keep them in view, please pin your video by clicking on the 3 dots at the top right corner of the ASL interpreter's video tile and have your view set to speaker view. For optimal viewing for everyone, please stop your video and then click on the 3 dots in the top right corner of your tile. There you can select hide non-video participants. This will clear up the screen for everyone. We will be recording this meeting to share with those who cannot be here right now. If you have technical issues or technical questions, please ask them in the chat and our volunteers will try to answer them very quickly. If you have questions for our panelists, please also ask them in the chat. And now I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Steve Diaz. Steve is the Deputy Director of Operations at the Los Angeles Community Action Network, LA-CAN. LA-CAN works to ensure low-income people and Black, Indigenous, and people of color have the opportunity to be engaged in political education, regular leadership developmental activities, community or public decision-making processes, strong coalitions with shared principles, the advancement of bold demands and solutions, and strategic negotiation processes. Thank you, Steve, and take it away.
You're muted, Steve.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this beautiful afternoon and joining us to talk about such an important topic, such as mutual aid and race and sort of coalition building in these critical times, as many Angelenos and people across the country are taking to the streets to protest and demand equity. Today, I have the privilege of facilitating this panel, of moderating this panel, that's really gonna give concrete examples of interracial coalition building and solidarity initiatives in the city of Los Angeles happening now. Once again, my name is Steve Diaz with the LA Community Action Network, and I wanna give thanks to everyone again who joined us and all the panelists who are gonna be joining us. For folks who are on, we like to practice the idea of inclusion. So we're gonna ask everyone to please take a second as we're gonna go to and introduce our panelists. Take a second, say your name, say the community you're from in the chat box, and answer one key question. Have you participated in mutual aid efforts during the pandemic or overall in general? We definitely want to know about mutual aid efforts going on across the city of LA, because we know Angelenos across the city is what makes this place such beautiful and such rich culture that it is, culturally that it is. Our panelists today that are going to be joining us, Susan Parks is a longtime community organizer in Los Angeles, where she has lived for 45 years. She's a chef, restaurant owner, cooking instructor, and writer, and has worked with numerous Asian American communities and grassroots organizations. Susan is the founder of Asian Americans for Housing, which provides interlanguage, cultural competent, direct aid and service for most isolated, at-risk, unhoused Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Her, along with Sarita Jones, who's another panelist, will talk a little bit about the South Central LA Food Bank Initiative for low-income Black seniors and many other projects that are happening jointly. Sarita Jones, another panelist, is a South Central Los Angeles community member for over 40 years. Sarita is the co-founder of the Baldwin Lemur Park Crenshaw local chapter of the Los Angeles Tenants Union, has taken lead in organizing her tenants and her building and the property that she lives in. She is also active in several other organizations, such as ACE Action. She's a steering committee member of the End Homelessness Now campaign, a board member of the Liberty Community Trust Land Trust, and in 2019, she formed We're Back, Black and Korean Coalition with Susan Park, that now operates the South Central LA Food Bank Initiative that provides in-language cultural competent support for low-income Blacks and Asian seniors. Sissy Tran is our other panelist. She is from the South Asian Community Alliance and is the founder and executive director of SICA. Her family fled Vietnam and moved to Los Angeles when she was a toddler. A determined advocate for social justice, Sissy realized very few organizations address the needs of the South Asian community in LA. So she envisioned and created a new program called SICA, empowering the South Asian community through leadership development, education, advocacy, and organizing. And our last panelist is Roderick Hall from Abundant Housing. Roderick is an organizer with Abundant Housing, which is committed to community development. He oversees Abundant Housing LA's organizing efforts and works to engage members and volunteers in pro-housing outreach, building pro-housing coalitions for change, creating educational events that empower people to make their voices heard on the housing crisis. I really wanted to make this conversation really personal, so I asked everybody to share something really interesting about themselves before I introduce them. So before our first panelist, Susan Parks, it comes up, I just want to share a tidbit. So for folks that ever see her in the struggle, Or in the lines of Cookie, know that she loves chocolate ice cream and she loves to punch punching bags. So be ready, be square. I give it over to Susan Parks.
Hi, my name is Susan Park. It's not Parks. So I saw a young man die in the streets this morning, so I'm a little shooken up. I'm going to be reading most of my panel discussion. So I was born in Seoul, South Korea to a comfortable family. I moved to Los Angeles when I was 5 years old in January of 1975 with my parents and two older brothers. Los Angeles was very openly racist back then. Trump-level racism was a daily occurrence. Being an Asian American is a political term for me. It is an interconnected history of immigration, labor exploitation, and racism, as well as a common political agenda to fight for justice for ourselves and other marginalized BIPOC. Saying that I am Asian American is a fight that I am picking with white supremacy, vulture crisis capitalism, and patriarchies, including Asian and BIPOC ones. Asian men and BIPOC men are still men. Being an Asian American is an idea. It's not my personal identity. The Asian continent and Pacific Islands represent hundreds of ethno-linguistic groups. Our shared experience in America is our Americanness and otherness. It is not our Asianness or Pacific Islanderness. I am Korean because that is my heritage. I am not Korean American to avoid racism against Chinese Americans. I am Asian American to fight racism against Chinese Americans and to stand in solidarity with other Asian Americans who are being harmed or marginalized. I am not Asian American to veil specific issues to Korean Americans or subgroups of Korean Americans. I am not Asian American to collectivize the wrongs of Korean Americans or a Korean American person. At this point, I would say that I am a very privileged Korean American person at the social level. I have light skin, I am middle class and not presenting, and I speak English. Benefiting from white privilege is not an active gift that white people gave me. It means that most of the time they stand out of my fucking way. Except when it comes to loans and housing. I will never get the kind of loans that white men or East Asian men get in America. While growing up, most of my Asian American friends were of East Asian heritage, specifically Korean, Cantonese, and Japanese, and all that represents our immigration patterns. We did not identify as Asian Americans or Oriental. This came later in the 1990s, Asian American identification. We were the first generation of Asian Americans to benefit from the model minority myth. It wasn't hard work and extra study time that got us there. White Americans simply decided to be less and less racist to subgroups of Asian Americans, mostly East Asians, who would have done well anyway, as long as white people left us alone. At some point, probably starting the mid-90s to late 1990s, white Americans started giving some of us the same benefit of the doubt they gave each other. In other words, white privilege. It wasn't until I was in high school that I met Vietnamese and Southeast Asian kids. I never forgot what a few of them said to me. They said, Susan, we're not all the same kind of immigrants. Your family left Seoul on a Boeing 747 with brand new clothes and 3 suitcases. My family left Vietnam or Cambodia on a boat. I remember starving for days and days. And I thought about this when I found out that one of the police officers present during George Floyd's murder is Hmong American. His name is Du Tao. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I want to address issues I've seen online that don't intersect in real life. Since this is an online panel, I think it is safe to assume that a critical mass of you are wired in. The Hmong are a nationless people from Southeast Asia. Hmong Americans came to the United States as refugees. After siding with America during the American War in Southeast Asia, also known as the Vietnam War or the Second Indochina War, Hmong Americans have a very high poverty rate, and they didn't have much choice in where they were settled in America. Neither did other Southeast Asians. Their experience is a far cry from the comfortable San Fernando Valley suburban existence of my childhood and my East Asian American friends. We are not Asian like the Hmong, and they are not Asian like us. There is no coherent or unified Asian American community. It's a political term. I have also kept up with what's been happening with Hmong Americans and want to support their efforts towards reconciliation and interethnic coalition building in their communities. Asian Americans, mostly very privileged East Asian Americans, pounced on to do Tao immediately in the virtual world of social media. While it is easy to flatten another person and an entire group online, it became rote for a subgroup of East Asian Americans who describe themselves as beneficiaries of adjacency to whiteness. In other words, they admit to their privileged position, and then they used it to demand, to command, and to order Du Tao and other Asian Americans to do better. Our community needs to do better. Only reveals the falsehood of this claim of Pan-Asian solidarity. There are Black and brown Asians, darker, poorer Asian Americans, Southeast Asians, and Asian Americans who don't speak English that tend to suffer more from income inequality, institutionalized racism, and anti-Asian violence. They do not benefit from the model minority myth or white privilege in the same way that a subgroup of East Asian Americans do. The tone deafness of privileged East Asian Americans has many problematic layers. East Asian Americans are racist towards Southeast Asian Americans. The worlds of wealthy East Asian Americans and Hmong Americans, for example, rarely intersect in real life. They don't intersect with poorer Asian Americans in general, unless we have hired them as invisibilized help. That happens a lot. So it is dubious at best when East Asian Americans with large social media and mainstream media platforms, choose Du Tao to suddenly include Hmong Americans in the conversation about Asian Americans. It is egregious to assume that all Asian Americans enjoy the same sort of privileges as well-to-do East Asian Americans, while using this privileged platform to disassociate from the apparent racism of Du Tao, and by extension, Hmong Americans. This is akin to Korean and Chinese Americans who wore pins that said, I am not Chinese, or I am Chinese, or I am Korean, when Japanese Americans were being rounded up for internment in concentration camps. At the time, some Korean Americans announced, I hate the Japs more than you do. This is in effect what elite East Asian Americans are saying. I hate Du Tao more than those racist and ignorant Asian Americans more than you do. There is another online movement in which elite Asian Americans feel the need to tell Asian Americans who don't speak English to not call the police. These are Asian Americans who, they don't call the police in the first place. And this is precisely why they are targeted by multicultural bands of home invasion robbers, for example. They specifically target non-English speaking Asian Americans because they don't call the cops. This movement suggests there is a problem of the Asian Americans who don't speak English calling the cops. And you're making a problem that doesn't exist, and it's contextualized vis-a-vis Black Lives Matter protests. So it's also suggesting that Asian Americans who don't speak English call the cops on Black and brown people. So it solves a non-existent problem and creates more problems by racially villainizing Asian Americans who don't speak English. It scapegoats people who are not even a part of these online conversations. They don't speak English. Which brings me to another online exercise by upwardly mobile, elite educated, second generation Asian Americans. Letters for Black Lives, which was started in 2016 by Christine Su, a Chinese American ethnographer who was concerned that Chinese American support for Peter Liang, the Chinese American cop who shot and killed a Kai girl, a Black man, would surface again for another Chinese American cop. Philando Castillo's killer was described as a Chinese cop. It turned out that he was Latino. Phew. The problem she invented to solve never materialized, since it was, and so there were no Chinese Americans protesting. So I am quoting Christine Su. I saw a bunch of other Asian people who I follow online start to kind of freak out preemptively about the possibility of yet another situation where the first generation Asian Americans or the Asian American community would come out in support of the cops again. Su uses the term Chinese American and Asian American interchangeably, when the reality is that Peter Liang's defenders in real life were almost entirely Chinese American. Su's letter translation performance piece fizzled off for a while. Then it recently resurfaced, and it is now translated into dozens of languages. I ask, who are these translated letters for? They seem to be more for the people who are translating them and widely publicizing them than they are for actual people in real life. I read the Korean iterations of both English and Korean for Black Lives Matter, the letters. I speak Korean well enough to have political discussions with my parents. I only went to Korean school for one day, so it was difficult for me to read the Korean text. I'm quoting from the English text. I acknowledge that the relationship between the Korean American and African American communities is complex. These thoughts should not distract us from thinking about what the right thing to do is. I understand that you are worried and scared about the lootings and damages that you are seeing, especially because of our familiarity with the destruction from the 1992 LA uprising and the pain felt by the Korean American community. These sentences are torn straight from white stream media and Asian American studies courses for Asian Americans who crave an upper income stratified diversity. There is a 5-mile east-west geographical band that separates South Central LA and Koreatown. The two communities don't have a complex relationship because they are not intertwined. As such, they have almost no relationship. A handful of Korean business owners in South Central LA only make up a tiny fraction of Korean-owned businesses in Los Angeles. The vast majority of Korean-owned businesses that were damaged during the 1992 riots in Koreatown, vast majority of Korean-owned businesses that were damaged during the 1992 riots were in Koreatown. There was an uprising in South Central LA that never made it to Koreatown. South Central LA was barricaded by the LAPD and later the National Guard. Black people did not have a beef with Koreans in general or Koreatown. They did not want to damage Koreatown, and they did not even come to Koreatown. Most of the looters in Koreatown were Latinx who did not care about police brutality against Black Americans at the time. Suggesting that 1992 Korean Americans from Los Angeles might be triggered by seeing Black Lives Matter protests suggests that in 1992 in Koreatown was a Black riot and that today's looters are mostly Black. Neither one of these things are true. Worse, this often repeated narrative frame harms both Koreans and Blacks, Japanese American-owned businesses in the Crenshaw district and Leimert Park, and Thai American-owned businesses in what would later become Thai Town were also targeted by anti-Asian sentiments during 1992.
Susan, as you're talking about Leimert Park, can you talk a little bit about the collective mutual aid work that you've been doing with Sarita?
I'm going to talk about that a lot because there's going to be a lot of overlap. I don't want to repeat what Sarita's going to talk about, and I also work with Sissy a little bit. So this is just important to clear up. The rooftop Koreans from 1992 are trending again on social media. There is a Huffington Post article, the real tragic story behind that roof Korean meme you may have seen, written by Brittany Wong with the subheadline, "Those who share rooftop Korean memes owe it to store owners in the photos to dig into the history of the 1992 LA uprising and what led them to take up arms." Like many journalists, Wong juxtaposes events over there and events with events over here. That's what's happening a lot online. Unrelated events that happened at the same time being juxtaposed together in stories and social media posts. And she's doing the same thing that white supremacists and extremist Asian Americans who are online doing. She frames the rooftop Koreans vis-a-vis Black Lives Matter protests and suggests that the rooftop Koreans of 1992 were shooting in the air at Black protesters or Black looters. They were not. They were not. They were shooting into the air at mostly Latinx looters, arsonists, and vandals, and nobody was killed by the, okay. Many of the Latinx writers in Koreatown were recent immigrants from Central America. So they probably had PTSD from civil wars and revolutions in their own countries. A lot of the Korean store owners probably had PTSD from the, and Black Americans, can have PTSD symptoms from hundreds of years of racial trauma inflicted by white supremacy. All of these online conversations have one thing in common. They make an Asian American person or Asian American group who is not part of the conversation. Okay, they make an Asian American person feel good or look good at the expense of another Asian American person or Asian American group who is not part of the conversation. They speak of anti-Blackness among Asian American communities or a single Asian American community without defining what that means. They are riddled with shame and guilt over their own white privilege and cannot find the words to talk about real anti-Asian violence. They seek answers in the mythical shared Asianness identity instead of our actual shared Americanness. There are almost no aggrieved Black people or a Black person claiming injury because of anti-Blackness among Asian Americans, in particular Asian Americans who don't speak English. There are almost no Asian Americans who don't speak English thanking the translators. The disconnect should be obvious. I'm not claiming that anti-Blackness among Asian Americans is not an issue. What I'm saying is that a magnifying glass has been applied to the same Asian Americans again and again, and an extremely distorted view has been created online. While at the same time, the privileged Asian Americans participating in this have not reflected on their own participation in white supremacy and anti-Blackness. We all live in America. We are all in the smog of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Privileged Asian Americans, in particular privileged East Asian Americans, should fight racism where it has power in the white spaces that we are privy to. Both of my parents were born at the tail end of Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula. They were 6 and 8 years old when the Korean Civil War erupted, which was also a proxy war for imperial forces. Approximately 5 million Koreans were killed during the Civil War. South Korea and North Korea are technically still at war. My parents were 15 and 17 years old when the April Revolution happened in South Korea. Student and labor groups protested President Syngman Rhee. The protests turned violent and Rhee resigned. It took almost 100 years from the time that the Yanban class was discarded in Korea for South Korea to achieve democracy. The irony
Hey,
is
Susan,
that
I'm sorry, I have to chime in.
a lot of overlap.
I know there's a lot of overlap, and I'm really sorry. I need to actually bring in Sarita.
Okay.
So next up is Sarita Jones, who's going to talk a lot about the work that she's been engaging in mutual aid in the Baldwin Hills Limmer Park community, as well as other sort of mutual aid efforts happening that she's engaged in. Sarita is also someone who I met a very long time ago now in her beautiful housing complex, which was a beautiful place. And it continues to be a beautiful place for people of African American and Black descent because of people like Sarita who fought to keep it and maintain it affordable. Sarita, it's all you.
Rita, you're muted.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Steve. I appreciate that. I just wanted to give a little brief history about how I come to do what I do. I actually was born, I'm a native Angelino. A lot of people can't really say that, but I am. I was born right here at General Hospital in the city of Los Angeles. I have actually been in my community for the last 40 years. I have graduated from the high school, which is Dorsey High, right across the street. And I used to manage quite a few supermarkets in the neighborhood. I don't know how many people remember Boys Market on Western and Jefferson. And then I crossed over and went to Lucky's, which transitioned into Albertsons. And of course, I used to manage the Albertsons that's actually right here, half a mile from my house. So someone that has lived and worked and enjoyed the community for a very long time. And I have raised 5 adult children in this community. I also have 6 beautiful grandchildren that are also in this community. So you can see exactly why I am so deeply rooted, and some of these issues that we're faced now is very, very upsetting to me. And so how I started was one of the main reasons that the police and the city use nuisance abatement lawsuits and gang injunctions is to free the property from the people that are actually living here that have been here for a while. So with my apartment complex, the city had filed a nuisance abatement lawsuit on all 425 units. With that being said, you know, you have to see how vast that is. We're sitting on 17 acres, and we're not talking about just individual apartment units. We're talking about families. We're talking about, it's easily 1,200 to 1,500 people on this property, including the men, women, and the children. And with that being said, we quickly formed a tenant association in which I was very, very thankful. I had an opportunity to meet Steve, and I do have you mentioned a little bit later on. And we went into court, we fought the lawsuit, and we were able to be victorious. And so what that means is they were unable to displace all of us, at least for 36 months. They were not allowed to use the Ellis Act to remove all of us. They were not allowed to change some of the rules and restrictions on the property so they can easily move us out. And of course, the owners were waiting and utilizing this tactic by the city in order to increase the rent by $600 per unit. So you can imagine 425 times 6. That is what they were willing to gain from getting rid of us. So with that work and all of the people that I had opportunity to meet, and I did want to mention there was a lot of organizations that I reached out to me during this fight. And those organizations were the Los Angeles Tenants Union, of course. It was LA CAN, that's how I met Steve Diaz. He was able to come and help us moderate one of our community meetings. It was the YJC, the Youth Justice Coalition, and then there was DSA, among others. And please, hopefully no organization that reached out to us. And then that kind of brings us into the topic of how do we organize and how do we make these connections and these relationships. So once my fight was over, thank God it was only 10 months, we came up with an agreement. It came with a little restitution, which benefited every single tenant that was on this property. We were able to, I personally was able to go out and start going to the meetings. So I have been in Steve's house for a meeting. I have been to the DSA and I've done panels for them similar to this one. I have gone to the Los Angeles, helped the fight with other renters of, you know, all nationalities, predominantly African Americans, which is one of the reasons why they literally wanted me to set the BLC, which is the Baldwin. We were underrepresented, and there was no one that could handle us. I actually stemmed from the South Central local, which is way on Vermont and 60th, and we decided to divide the city, and so we can help more people. And I realized that there is over 100,000 people in this vicinity, and that's a lot of work. So a lot of volunteers are needed. With that being said, I also do work for ACE, Action Los Angeles, and that's where I personally learned how to go to Sacramento and lobby for some of the legislation that we have won in the last year, and still fighting for them. And majority of them are in CD 10 and CD 8. We are the most vulnerable. And I have met a lot of individuals, and our union is multicultural, actually. So we have every color under the rainbow, including the rainbow. So we are very, very thankful for the people that come and help us fight the fights that we fight. We have to remember that we all live in this community. We are all one people. We are all under the same thumb of the white supremacists and their hold and their systematic racism. There has never, ever been a time where I have not been able to go to a Louisiana fried chicken and buy Chinese food at the same time. And this is the way that we have always lived in unison together, and we have to remain the community that we are. And we don't want outside narratives coming in and dictating how we should feel about each other. We need to make sure that we have those conversations, we share the space, and we clear up some of the misconceptions that they have fed us about each other's nationality or race. It's one of those things where you look at the work that I do, and one of the most recent projects that we're working on is with I'm the chairperson of the Liberty Community Land Trust, and we have just been successful in blocking the purchase of the Crenshaw Mall. Now, what does that mean? That means a host of things for our community. All of the businesses that we have lost, all of the people that have been marginalized and set aside, all of the organizations, we need to come in together and make that mall what we want it to be. You know, there's always people that are pushing us out and dictating what we should have in our community, and we should just take it like it and be quiet about it. Well, no, because I watched a lot of the legacy businesses in my community being Asian owned and Black owned, and they're leaving. And we need to have a space, and we need to hold that 40 acres of that mall for our vision of how we want our community to be. So that is, it's very instrumental. And we have to do the political education. We have to realize that Los Angeles is sitting on Tongva land. We have to understand and acknowledge the indigenous people that were here prior to us, and give them recognition. One of the other things that we're doing is, along with Susan Park and I, we came up with the Black Child First initiative. And what that is, it's a way to somewhat put a dent in when we originally had First Five initiative years ago, and that has been scrapped to the wayside. And what we realize is that African-American children are basically at the bottom of the totem pole. And, you know, they need resources, they need help, they need to be taught and educated by people that look like them and have their understanding of their culture in mind. And then we need to have those conversations. We need community efforts. There are a lot of organizations that are within the community that actually stay hidden, and we need to start visiting those other locations, making those relationships, working with each other, and also helping each other on our joint projects and ventures, because we're all in this fight together. One of the things that I also wanted to mention is the mutual aid that Susan and I have been doing. And I think during this COVID-19, it has actually stressed a lot of people and a lot of families. And there's a lot of silence about it. There's a lot of elderly seniors that are Asian and Black that are not leaving their houses, that are struggling, that may not have that support system, that may not have someone to bring them the food and the things that they need. And we're trying our very, very best to fill that gap. There are volunteers, and we are thankful for them for helping us out. I am so thankful for Susan turning her restaurant into a food bank in order to make this happen. I personally have had, I think my highest number was a distribution of 437 food packages within 1 week. And that is, it's very stressful. And I have ventured off into something that I had never done before, but it is fulfilling. The people are thankful. They're very grateful just to receive something that someone has thought about them. And we want to keep that going. We want to make sure that even if we have the second wave of COVID, we want to maintain, the health and the welfare and the people that are most marginalized in mind. We attempt to do what we can when we can. and I feel kind of blessed in order to be part of that and to be included in that. And along with our Black Asian Coalition, we also have our Black Korean Coalition. And we need to start having those hard conversations about what we think of each other and get that out on the table so we know where to dispute the myths about each other's culture. It's the funniest thing is that my daughter left and went to college, and her major originally was international business. And so she has definitely learned to speak Mandarin. And I could never understand why I would pass by when she was in high school. She would be watching her K-dramas, that's what she calls them, her K-dramas, and she'd be chuckling. And I could not understand a word that was being said, but she's chuckling, so obviously she understands. And in school, she was not only the president of the Chinese club, but she was treasurer of the Korean club. So she has surprised me. I'm very thankful. I'm very proud of her. She has been to Korea twice, and she's had a wonderful time. And I guess I can't tell you how proud I am of her. And then, of course, please don't let me mention that she is the serious K-pop fan. So what that means is anytime played, and
so as
there were
Sarita is
Korean boys all over her wall, in her room, even on the ceiling when I went to visit in college. So I just wanted to, bringing it to a close, I wanted to just uplift the fact that we need to understand each other's culture. We need food, and we need to maintain those relationships. Is that good, Steve?
That's so perfect. I was actually gonna say when I heard the noise, I thought you were starting to do your own cake pop remix.
Oh no, that's probably outside noise. Thank you.
No, thank you. So Sarita talked about solidarity, right? They talked about it starts with a conversation. She talked about partnership. It's just not about one person. It's about a group of people, and it's about how people show up for each other. So one of the things we really wanted to get out of this conversation was really highlighting those strategies, right? How it is that during this time of COVID-19 and the importance of supporting one another, how communities have shown up for each other. So a good friend of mine is up next, Sissy Tran, who I feel like every time I talk to her about it, she's always talking about, I'm trying to figure out another strategy as it comes to sort of mutual aid. I was actually had the pleasure of meeting Sissy through some of our community plan work and sort of our power building work. But the floor is yours, Sissy. Tell us about your work.
Hi, everybody. My name's Sissy Trin, and I run a small organization that does youth organizing in Chinatown and Lincoln Heights. And we were actually created to address the intersection between race and class. Basically, what we were seeing in a lot of the social justice world was if you cared about class issues, then it was a completely Black or Latino, right? Because the assumption was that Asian Americans are model minority, similar to what Susan had said earlier. And then if you're Asian and you want to talk about racial justice and economic justice, more often than not, most Asian American organizations talked about glass ceiling issues, about affirmative action and getting kids into elite colleges and Asian American kids into elite colleges and university. However, with Southeast Asians, a lot of us came over as refugees. Many of our parents have less than a third grade education, and a lot of Southeast Asians aren't graduating high school. And so for us to work on affirmative action and getting them into Harvard was not a really good use of our specific time and energy and needs. And so we really wanted to focus on how do we empower low-income APIs specifically. And so a lot of our residents, like I said, work in garment, in restaurant, where they're getting paid under the table. And so about maybe 10 years ago, we started working on some housing issues. I was actually lobbied by our 15-year-old members. This was an issue that we had no experience working on, didn't know what we were doing, but they basically argued, like, if you are pushing us to go off to college and we don't tackle this issue, we're going to come back with no homes to live in. And so that's kind of how we got involved in housing, and we started Googling, how do you build affordable housing? And one of the things that I think has been really interesting and eye-opening for us is, for those of you who don't know about the affordable housing world, basically there's two types of affordable housing. There's subsidized housing for low-income folks, and then subsidized housing for folks who are homeless and need permanent supportive housing. What we discovered was that we are a third category. We're basically too poor for regular affordable housing, but we're not in a position that where we need supportive housing like the folks who are homeless. So basically we got disqualified. And so that's how we started organizing and trying to figure out, like, how do we push for housing that is actually affordable to us and that we qualify for? And that's kind of where I first met Steve many, many years ago. And then fast forward to March 2020. And overnight, we went from youth organization that does policy advocacy, coalition building, all these different things to, among other things, Amazon. So we started figuring out logistics around how do you purchase things in the middle of a pandemic when supply lines have been completely shut off. So I spent a lot of time trying to find soap and basic things like that. And we also became the public health department, because what we were realizing was that a lot of our residents, they don't speak English, and the city and the county weren't translating materials into Chinese and Vietnamese and Khmer. Or if they were putting it online. But we have a lot of residents who don't have regular access to internet. Some of our seniors don't know what the internet is. And so where are they going to get information? And so they were getting a lot of misinformation, and a lot of confusion and a lot of, like, rumors. And so we started paying to, ourselves to print flyers and materials and redoing some of them so that they're easier to read. I don't know if you saw some of those flyers that the county had initially created. The fonts were really tiny and difficult to read. We also became the Department of Children and Family Services. So we started by basically calling all of our households and trying to get a sense of what they needed and what they wanted, and what they were struggling with, and realizing that it wasn't just simply, hey, do you have enough food? Or, hey, what do you need? I had to reach out to friends of mine who are counselors and therapists and social workers to learn how to do an intake, right? And set up intake systems, and then train my staff who are not social workers or counselors to do intakes. And so instead of asking, like, hey, do you have enough food? What we would do was ask, what'd you eat today? How was it? Was it enough? And then through a course of leading conversation or leading questions, we were able to find out, actually, they don't have enough food, and start a conversation and build trust and comfort to be like, well, what do you need? Let us buy it for you, right? And so it's been super crazy to kind of change all of this. I've been really grateful for my friendship with Steve, because a lot of our folks experience a lot of the same things that folks in Skid Row experience, right? A number of our members live in what are called SROs, single room occupancies, where you basically rent a room and then share with everybody else in the building one kitchen and one bathroom, right? And so we were, like, trying to figure out, how are we feeding these people, or how are these people getting fed in a way that's safe, right? Because if there's only one kitchen, then that means that they're not staying isolated in their own units. But then how do we provide them with food and on a regular basis? And so a lot of it was just random conversations I would have with Steve, where he'd be like, hey, this is what we're doing. This is what we've been doing, you know, in the SROs and Skid Row. Or, hey, have you hooked up with this person there? This organization's providing food bags, all of these different things. Susan's been a lifesaver, providing like, I don't know how many hundreds of hot meals out of Revolucionario Tacos, as well as funding to pay the local restaurants. But I think for us, like in terms of doing multiracial stuff, it's our neighborhood, even though it's Chinatown, is multiracial. There's a lot of Latinos, there's a small number of African Americans. And then I'm gonna be honest with you, like Asian American is this identity that's in some ways very forced, because Asians represent half the world's population, right? And so to kind of think of us as like one monolith without recognizing the millennia of tensions and colonization and war between countries and all kinds of history is to just kind of completely ignore the reality of how diverse our communities are. And so working with Chinese immigrants in Chinatown in many ways is distinct from working with Southeast Asian refugees, but then also kind of linking to the folks in Skid Row, you know, who are predominantly Latino and African American, and learning about their struggles and how much we have in common, you know. And prior to the pandemic, you know, Steve and I, along with our colleagues over in Little Tokyo, are part of this coalition called Central City United. And we've been doing member exchanges with, you know, the Sika youth and, you know, small business owners in Little Tokyo, and then residents in Skid Row. And, you know, the first couple of exchanges were really awkward because it was like, who are these people? Do we have anything in common with them? We probably don't. But by the third one, you know, or the second one, I can't even remember, people started kind of realizing, oh, we actually have a lot in common, right? But it took a lot of work, because it took work for, you know, LA Can and Sika and Little Tokyo Service Center to build trust amongst the staff before we opened up connections with the members, right? Because I'm not gonna like bring my members to Skid Row or Little Tokyo if I feel like I can't trust LA Can or LTSC, right? So there had to be a certain amount of organizational trust building and, you know, and vision sharing and value sharing before we brought the members in together. And of course, a lot of intention, you know, but I think part of it too is just really with both the organizing and the mutual aid work, fundamentally like having an ally who I can go to and say, you know, community land trusts don't work for our people. Our folks are too poor. So what's the strategies that we can come up with together, right? Or, you know, thinking about like how to feed folks who live in SROs without, you know, buying them equipment that will short out the electricity. Like that was a funny conversation I had with Steve about, you know, buying rice cookers for everybody, or considering buying rice cookers. And so I think it's complex and it's a daily practice, right? It's a daily practice for me to remember, like, you know, not just like, what do I need to do today? Which when we went into pandemic, like mutual aid mode, that was literally like every 4 hours, I was like, what am I doing for this 4 hours? What am I doing for that 4 hours? And now that things have stabilized, I guess you could say, like we've been living in pandemic world for 3 months now. And supply lines are starting to open up again. It's now starting to think about like, what's the long-term strategy of like the work we're doing, right? Because we can continue to do mutual aid, but we want to envision and fight for a better world, right? And how do we do that when we can't be in physical community with each other, you know? And so how do we continue to build relationships between residents in Chinatown and Skid Row if not everybody has access to tech and not everybody has, people can't be in the same space together because of social distancing concerns, right? And so that's kind of the big challenge that I have.
That's definitely the big challenge that I think we all have and we're struggling with on this call. Thank you so much, Sissy, for sharing your story. Yeah, there's plenty of stories that could have been shared in terms of some random conversations we had. And I hope to get to them later as we have the sort of group conversation. I want to bring up Broderick. Sorry if I messed up your name, but can you tell us a little bit about abundant housing and sort of what it is that you're doing and sort of how sort of mutual aid, sort of racial, cross-racial organizing is occurring from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And also thank you to everyone who's spoken thus far. So just the background about me, I actually just moved to LA in February, mid-February, right before, everything happened. I'm originally from a small rural town in North Carolina. And now that I'm here, I am in an organizing capacity. So before I even get started mostly about like the organization itself, I come to this work from more like service learning and direct, on the ground learning, and also from like a research perspective. So as an organization, Abundant Housing is focused on housing for all people, and working towards creating that goal within the Los Angeles region. And relatively speaking, in terms of having paid staff and folks who can be dedicated to this work, we are new. And 3 of the 4 of us were just hired within the last few months of this year at the very beginning in February and March. And so for me, it has been a lot of moving to a brand new city, and getting to know all the people and all the folks doing this work, which is a lot of playing catch up. And at the same time, trying to build relationships with folks and trying to understand what that looks like from our perspective. But I think for me, people have talked about, in particular, racial solidarity and ethnic solidarity. And I think there's also a generational component. So I just turned 24, and my experience in general in the, United States is gonna differ from some of the other panelists who are older, and not necessarily in a bad way, but to kind of, I think, just illustrate how much the work of older folks has changed the perceptions of younger folks. Zarita talked about her daughter, who is, very involved with both Chinese and Korean culture. And I think in general, my generation, we are much more multicultural, right? And so to hear people talk about some of these issues, it is very mind-blowing, because a lot of it for me has been like, I didn't even know this was ever an issue between my group and another group, and trying to dissect that as it relates to us moving forward has been very just eye-opening. And in particular, understanding that Los Angeles has an entirely different makeup in terms of ethnic groups to ethnic groups, which is where I think we also should be going with our discussions, because ultimately no racial group is, all in the same. Blackness, the Latinx community, the Asian American and Pacific Island community, even the white community, there are so many ethnicities within our racial groups that is really hard to just try and dissect and talk about how one big group has an issue with another big group, when it is much more complicated than that. Sissy spoke, and it's something I've been talking about with some friends who are more Southeast Asian or South Asian, which is, when we think about groups, we talk about and we say like, okay, this group is a model minority, everyone in this group is low income. But something I had talked about with y'all before, and in the past role I was doing, we were talking about data equity and what does it mean to really talk about data and how we can use data to showcase the truths of our world, because ultimately that's what we're trying to do. And understanding that darker skinned Asians in particular, in a lot of ways, are going through what Black folks, or I should say Black folks who are descendants of the enslaved Africans, because I also don't want to conflate the Black experience. There's a lot of overlap there, right? You know, being low income, just not being able to think about, you know, Ivy League institutions or things, just trying to think about the bare necessities of life, if you will, you know, having your basic needs taken care of. And I think those kind of conversations need to happen more, and being understanding to each group's historic relationship with, you know, toxic whiteness and toxic masculinity and patriarchy and all of these things operates within this country and within the broader world, and how sometimes what this country has done has actually in other countries has brought folks from those countries to this country. And, you know, understanding that our liberation is collective, I think is very important. And for me also, it has been a lot of, you know, as it relates to housing in particular, because I think a lot of us are operating in this particular space, it's very important to talk about who's involved in, you know, my organization. And for me, and what we're trying to do now is there are two things as it relates to race relations and people who are living in certain experiences. I think direct aid organizations and organizations who are working more intimately with folks as it relates to housing is so crucial to organizations like mine who do more long-term aspirational work. Because having worked in state government, I can tell you that what Sissy brought up regarding like single room occupancies and things of that nature, those aren't always talked about in the space of government or in the spaces of folks who are doing more long-term aspirational work. And it's very important that we hear those experiences so that the work we do as government bodies, when I was working in government or now that I'm working in a nonprofit that is focused on something that's not going to happen overnight, so to speak, we can make sure we honor those experiences and that we bring those experiences into the conversation. And I think we all know that sometimes that's not the case for various reasons, sometimes intentionally and sometimes not. But as a person working for this kind of organization, making sure that, you know, we have a policy committee, and if any folks here are on this conversation, we have both the policy committee and are working on creating an equity and racial justice committee, centering those folks in those kinds of committees. And at the same time, Susan spoke on a panel that we were putting together. So how can we begin thinking about giving a platform to organizations doing more direct aid so that our volunteers and members can be more aware of both, like, here's what's happening, here's what needs to happen in a more long term, but here are the people doing the work right now more directly and more intimately, and trying to figure out what that looks like. And we've started that process and continue to want to reach out to folks who are doing this work to make sure I can honor that, because I think a lot of times what happens is that people continue to operate in their silos and continue to just do work, not realizing that collectively we have more power, and collectively, you know, we, you know, to use the phrase stronger together, that's what we are. And I think it takes the conversations that are being had. And even for me as a younger person, I think trying to understand as a person who has like multi-ethnic friends, and that has been a bigger norm for me in my life compared to like the elders in my community, or probably even in my friends of different ethnicities in those communities as well. Understanding for us, I think accountability is important, and how do we hold the elders of our communities to be accountable, and to think about, okay, we understand that when you were growing up, this was quote unquote the norm, but that's not the case anymore. And so just to kind of wrap it back up, like I said, if folks are interested in being, you know, directly involved with trying to bring their direct lived experience, which is crucial to the work I do in my organizing. We have two different committees for that, and at the same time as just the individual who's younger and also a Black American and trying to navigate all of this, figuring out ways, not necessarily to hold my friends accountable, but how my friends and I can come together to hold, one, each other accountable, but mostly importantly, thinking about the fact that there's a generational tension that needs to be addressed that we may not always be aware of or have experienced in our personal relationships.
Thank you so much, Roderick, for sharing. It was a really powerful conversation and presentations that folks had. We're going to transition into more of a conversation, and we're going to try to include some of the questions that folks have been sort of including in the chat box. Just real quickly, I wanted to share some reflections around sort of what I have heard, and then I'm going to ask some questions of each panelist. I heard the importance of understanding our history and understanding our own experiences, right? Knowing our experiences can be different, but also knowing that by talking about those experiences and conversations and our histories in these conversations, we can build bridges and we can build trust. Having conversations, right? Coming to the table and just opening up about exactly what it is that we're looking for and sort of challenging the norms like Roger talked about, right? Changing, no longer allowing the status quo to occur. Supporting each other, talking about how, and really making it about an action, not just about a word, but really an activity, right? Solidarity starts with everything that I heard, from opening up your restaurant to providing meals to creating programming in our communities that can help build the infrastructure that has long been forgotten in our neighborhoods, to trust building. And that's going to be my first question. There was a question that really talked about trust and how is it that you build trust sort of across diverse ethnic and sort of racial communities. So I'm going to start off by actually asking Zarita, if you wouldn't mind sharing just a little bit around like your partnership and your relationship with Susan, sort of how was it that you guys became to be friends and sort of have that trust occur? And then Susan, I'm going to ask the same for you, about you and Zarita as well. Zarita?
Well, actually, Susan and I went to the same middle school, and we met when the Los Angeles Tenants Union was hosting a dinner in her restaurant. So from that relationship, we were able to come together, sit down, talk. We hit it off just beautifully. And from there, she became a member of the BLC, which is the Baldwin Mertz Crenshaw Local of the Los Angeles Tenants Union. And just us having these conversations and getting together and having that space and doing our pre-COVID Sunday tea, which is, I really miss that. Just creating these coalitions in order to put things together so we can have that hard conversation, so we can dispel some of those myths, and hopefully it'll grow and people will begin to understand. So Susan and I, we see eye to eye. She may be Korean, I may be African American, but we see eye to eye.
Susan, you want to jump in? You're muted.
The middle school that Zarita and I went to was Portola Middle School in Encino. So I was in the highly gifted magnet program there. I was bused from one white neighborhood, Northridge, to another predominantly white neighborhood, Encino. And Zarita was bused. She was a PWT student from South Central LA to the west San Fernando Valley. So we were the first generation of American public children who went rapidly desegregated schools that were not just Black children going to a white school, but Latinx kids, all mixed in terms of income and background too. And obviously, Latinx and affluent Black kids too were mixed in. So Zarita was there when Janet Jackson. She was friends with Janet Jackson. I was friends with John Singleton, and so we both grew up. Now we're like this first generation of American public school children. We are 50 to 55-ish, and we all grew up together. This is very different from 1992. And in a lot of ways, American public school children of a younger generation in Los Angeles, more segregated schools than we did, because we were just all thrown. So we have to figure it out. Adults didn't give us the words. We have to figure it out as children. So we don't have a long history of trust and talking to each other and listening. And I think that's about it. I mean, listening to people is really important.
Hey, Sissy, I want to bring you into this conversation now. I know you talked a lot about sort of trust as well, and sort of how it was important to build organizational trust. Is there anything you want to sort of share and more, or just some sort of strategies or ideas that came into your head when you were talking about sort of building between Chinatown, Little Tokyo, and Skid Row?
I mean, I think for me, a lot of times when people talk about trust, it's oftentimes, do we share the same vision of the world, right? And oftentimes the answer for folks that want to come work with Sika, the answer is yes. But then the second question I often ask is, can I rely on you, right? Because a lot of times I've met a lot of like activists who use really good fancy words about hegemony and capitalism and patriarchy and all this other stuff, but are total flakes, right? And so then for me, it's like, if I can't rely on you to show up, you know, and be there when you say you're going to be there, then I can't trust you, right? And I think a lot of it is about not just like, are you saying the right words, but are you showing up as an ally, right? And so for me, how I envision showing up as an ally for Skid Row is in spaces where people are talking about housing policy, you know, and if there's nobody in the room that represents Skid Row or the homeless community, then I'm going to be there to say, like, why isn't there someone, right? Or I'll say, you know, this is what our partners in Skid Row are saying, right? And making sure that their needs are represented. Not saying that I know what their need it is. I'm just mimicking or parroting what I'm hearing and being told, right? And not claiming ownership, but just kind of claiming space for them next time, saving a seat, essentially, right? And I think that's one way in which I can operate as an individual and as an organization, right? And I would ask that our allies in other neighborhoods do the same when we talk about issues around, whether it's immigration or education or whatever. What is happening in Chinatown? What is happening amongst low-income APIs? Because more often than not, we're always the one that's forgotten because the assumption is we're model minority, right? And so with COVID, what I was seeing a lot of was in conversations I was having with other Asian Americans, they were focusing on hate crimes and hate violence, which is important, but then a lot of them weren't talking about, well, what about the low-income folks who aren't getting access to information, who aren't getting access to food, who don't know how to get medical care, right? Like that was part of the missing conversation. And so trust building is, like I said earlier, a daily practice, and it's about how you show up, you know, and I'm not going to be perfect 100% of the time, and I can't expect that of other allies, but I think part of it is about building that long-term history, you know, and kind of like, oh, I can rely on you. Oh, we share the same values. And then when you bring in other people into the conversation, it is the responsibility of like me and Steve and Grant in Little Tokyo to make sure that the members we bring in have a structured space so that they can feel safe, right? Because when it's just me, Grant, and Steve, it's just the three of us. But when we're talking about bringing our members in from LA Can and Skid Row and Chinatown and Little Tokyo, we're talking like 20, 30, 40 people. So it needs to be facilitated in a way where people feel like they can share and that they can be a little vulnerable in sharing like what's going on and the challenges that they have so that we can build community. But it also takes regular effort. It's not something you can just do once and you're done.
Sure, effort is definitely key in order to make that happen. Roderick, you want to come in and talk a little bit about sort of your perspective when it comes to sort of building trust? I know Abundant Housing has sort of a perspective of housing for all. So sort of maybe you can share a little bit around sort of how trust is built using the Abundant Housing organizing model.
Yes, it's been very like a learning experience, right? To looking how I look in particular and coming into organization and, learning about what it means to build trust with my own community, right? And being entirely new to LA. So for me, it is a lot of rapid learning. But I think back to what Sissy said, and I think all folks who do the work of organizing know this first and foremost, it's not just what you tell us, it's what you show us. And it's really not enough. And I think we are seeing that just in the broader nation right now, right? People don't want to just be told that you care, and people certainly don't want to just be ripped off or feel like they are not heard. And I think the most important thing we can do is continue to figure out, for me, especially being in this role and working for this organization and wanting to make sure housing is for all, is how do you have conversations with a variety of folks who have different needs as it relates to their housing. And I believe we've heard that just even in the conversation of like the diversity within the AAPI community. And thank you to Sissy and Susan for bringing that up, which is like, not everyone has the same needs. And so for me, when I think about housing for all, I think about, okay, who are the various people in this region and in the city, and what kind of housing needs do they have? And like, how can I continue to, as an individual show up, but also while doing that, getting my organization to continue to do that at like the organizational level. And of course, now just being in this role for 4 months, and then of course, COVID happening, there has been a lot of, it makes it harder to do, not impossible, but harder for sure, because a lot of this work is best done in person. And in the case of like Susan Zarita, which I am a big champion of too, over food, because it helps bridge, gaps. But I think for me personally, I'll speak for myself, it has been difficult because I haven't been able to get out. I'm a part of a different, like the Healthy LA coalition. So I've tried to meet folks in that space and, contribute, but ultimately like trying to figure out how to connect with folks and understand how I can show up is somewhat difficult just due to everything happening in society. But again, I don't think what I'm saying is different than what Sissy's saying, which is like, you just have to show up and do stuff for people. And that's what I tell people, like how I was brought up is if you just help people, that's the easiest way to show trust, and I think a lot of folks overthink it. I was never brought up to have any issues with any ethnic group. And so that's just not in me. I'm not like looking at a group and being like, oh, there's a Korean American, like, I don't like you. Like, that's not something that is ingrained in me. So I don't necessarily walk through the world with that mentality. Like I said, I do try and understand the history of group to group. But for me as an individual, that's not in me. And so I can't even say I think that way. But what I do try and do is like mediate or hope that by me showing up, maybe some folks can see that, oh, someone who looks Black or someone who is working in this space is different or is trying to move the needle, which is hard because, again, if trust has been eroded from a group and you're trying to bring that back in, it's hard to build that trust back up, and it doesn't happen overnight. And this is the ultimate, I think, call to action for all of us as we talk multi-ethnic coalition building is how do we get that trust back up, and like people, especially as Americans, understanding that it doesn't happen overnight, and it's not this like, oh yeah, like I'm gonna get something. It's not Amazon Prime. We're not getting it in 2 days, right? So let's just understand that. And I've been really fortunate as a younger person too, I think, to be brought up after all the work that the elders have done to be multicultural and to be more aware of different ethnicities. And so I think like even just folks seeing a younger person who is about this action can see like this is a product of their work, and that, oh, okay, slowly but surely we are making progress. All of my friends are people of color, and all of us date a variety of ethnicities. Some of us date our own ethnicities, but we also just like, we just really don't care. Like there are a lot of things in the world, and like caring about someone's skin color is just not what we have time to do.
So I'm going to pivot on that note there's two questions that I need to definitely hit that I want to ask. One is for Susan. So can you just talk about what led you to just open up your restaurant and start doing mutual aid and sort of supporting the work of others? Like what was that instinct? What was that move that just said, I have to do this?
My parents, in particular, my mother, always, she looked for people to help. She would look for invisible people to help. And because I grew up pretty comfortable, and I have a lot of friends and supporters who will take care of me, and I understand how resources can be reallocated, and I have access to resources, I just felt very confident doing it, and that, I would get by. I would be able to earn my own income. I spent a lot of my own income on what I do, and then I will also get private donations. And I saw a problem coming. Zarita and I, we started Black and Asian Coalition and Black and Korean Coalition last year. And, we're both BIPOC people who grew up in Los Angeles. We understand how crisis is created via the political process and capitalism. So, really, Zarita and I were talking about it last year, like, when is the next shock crisis going to happen? So I was mentally prepared for it. And I own a restaurant, and my business wasn't going to go anywhere. I didn't really have customers. And I was, what am I going to do with all this food? I had like $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 worth of food. I might as well give it away. And there's always going to be more food. I know there's more stuff. I can get stuff in from Mexico. I can get stuff imported from China, South Korea. I have those business contacts too. I know I have access to produce trucks that'll drive in from Mexico. There's always food. There's going to be food. There's no shortage. So, and I can keep up with like different supply chains. And I was just like, what the fuck am I going to do? Hoard it and die by myself, or start giving it away and we all get better together? That's pretty much it.
That's a great example. Hey, Sissy, why don't you chime in and talk a little bit about one of the questions people had was around resources and sort of how do you shift and accessing resources. I know Susan talked a little bit about, I'm not going to let this food go to waste. I'm going to give it out. You want to talk a little bit about sort of how SICA pivoted into resources to obtain the resources to provide mutual aid?
Sure. So basically, our board voted to start doing pandemic relief like 5 days before the stay-at-home orders were put down. Like, I saw, like, this is coming. It's going to be a huge deal. How are people going to eat? How are people getting information? And so we had voted to set aside about $10,000 of our funds that we had in the bank to using it for whatever was needed, whether it was going to be hand sanitizer or rice or masks and gloves, right? We just knew like we needed it. And we figured like we would just apologize to our funders later for making the sudden shift, right? That the community's needs were greater than like our needs to be able to keep on this money. And then like I started like a Facebook fundraiser thinking like maybe we'll raise like, $2,000. That would be awesome. We ended up raising about 30,000, which is like amazing. But again, we just kind of responded with, we don't know where this money's coming from, but we can either hunker down and protect, hoard the money for ourselves and make sure that like my rent is paid and my staff's rent is paid, or we could just spend it all and make sure that we do the best that we can for our communities. And if we run out of money, then at least we tried. And that was kind of where we came from. And so we were really shocked at how fast and how generous people were in providing support. I will acknowledge that also, we had a sympathetic population we were working with, Asian seniors who are low income, right? And recognizing that that was a much more sympathetic image than if we're talking about other folks. And I want to say that just to kind of bring the conversation back to acknowledging like the race and class privileges that I have as a light-skinned Vietnamese American, and being able to kind of access that. And so just those kinds of mutual aid dynamics will change depending on the population you're working with and how sympathetic other people feel towards it. Because ultimately, like, I certainly don't have enough money to manage a mutual aid program myself. And I don't have access to like super wealthy donors. And so it's really contingent upon the broader public to kind of see like, this is a community that I want to support. And we lucked out.
Thank you, Sissy. So the last question that I'm going to hit that comes from the audience is, somebody wanted to know, how can direct aid work also be anti-racist work? Anybody want to sort of cue up that one? I'm not going to call on anyone.
I'm a privileged East Asian American woman, and I, advocate for people. I don't speak on their behalf. I echo what they say. And when I start, a program like Black Child First, an education initiative that's STEAM and manual arts focused. So there's a trade route and a path to college. Kids can be on both. It's not an either or choice. I think, me talking about low income Black and brown children and low income Asian children who need more education advantages, it positions, people look at the problem differently. They don't see it as a problem anymore. They're like, hey, why can't we give the same kind of comparative advantages, right? But also understanding that they come from low income families, so we need to, have more supportive services. But people look at the problem differently. I'm saying the problem is not of the child, the problem is of the environment. So, and then outreaching to isolated low-income Black seniors with Zarita, I am talking about the issues they face, and they are environmental. There are things, I talked to Zarita about, what do the low-income isolated Black seniors that Zarita, in Chesapeake apartments, what do they need? Because there's also a big Black diaspora, African diaspora in South Central, so and everywhere in LA and America. So it's going to be different. We have Caribbean seniors, Ethiopian seniors, but so with Zarita, she said the low-income seniors that she knows, Black seniors she knows, they want smaller packages because they worry about vermin. They have a lot of environmental problems. Their housing isn't well maintained. Now the low-income Korean American seniors, they love bigger packages. They hoard. So there are these cultural differences. Koreans hoard. I'm just telling you. There was a war, all whatever. But so, even these little cultural differences, me not imposing my idea of what a generous food package is what does a low-income Black senior who is in their 90s? They can't carry a 5 pound of rice like the Korean seniors can. They don't eat that much, but they like rice as a shelf-stable pantry item. For the Korean and East Asian and Southeast Asian seniors, rice is a staple. They eat it several times a day. So that kind of, providing mutual aid, one-on-one direct, curating it, customizing it to the person, to the group, to the person too, is anti-racism work, because we are shedding light on the environmental problems that they face. And it is not the problem of the individual, it is their environment that is forced on them. And it's unfair. Some of the things are just, I'm gonna cry a little bit again, but it's just so cruel. There's an older Black amputee who lives in Zarita's apartment complex, and he, pleaded for a first floor apartment, but the, white supremacist management company, forced him to live in a second floor unit with stairs. And we're talking about this now. We know, there's several thousand people who are gonna see this now. They know about this. So it is anti-racism work too.
Thank you so much, Susan. Sissy, Roderick, or Sharita, either one of you want to tee up that answer?
Sure. So prior to pandemic world, SICA did a lot of political education of our high school students. And so we would recruit them in 9th grade and teach them, or not teach them, but facilitate conversations to connect the dots for them. Because a lot of times they just saw Latino kids are treated differently than Asian, right? But not really understanding the systemic impacts and the reasoning behind why that treatment exists, right? And so I say this just because so much of the work, I think as a whole, and I think Black Lives Matter brought up like a new sense of urgency in talking about like anti-racist work, and how do we do it now? And it's urgent now. But the thing is that, you know, and I've always had to say this to my staff, we get our students for maybe 2 to 4 hours a week, and we're expecting to undo a lifetime of racist programming. I think it's an unreasonable expectation, right? And I say that for all of us, not just for like high school students. And so part of it is always being open to learning and challenging yourself and being uncomfortable, and then learning how to give and take, right? Because oftentimes we're asking like Black folks, like, show up for us and teach us about your oppression, right? And not really thinking about like, what is our role in maintaining that? What is the oppression that we experience, and how does it link to other people of color, you know, and sharing and challenging ourselves. And again, I go back to the word practice, because, you know, some days I'm better at it than other days, right? I am definitely far from anywhere near done or perfect. And so I just kind of feel like mutual aid has to think about like, what is the day-to-day thing that we're doing to move us towards, you know, away from direct service and more around equity and justice, right? And that's something that you can do a little bit every day, you can do a lot every day and differently, but it's not something that I have an easy answer for.
Zarita, why don't you jump in? We'd love to hear your answer.
Yeah, I think undoing it is not necessarily the answer, ultimately impossible, but you can acknowledge that that things have happened. You can understand, you can learn, you can have that political education. And that oppression, which most people don't understand, there is a level of, with African Americans, an internalized oppression. And that's, you know, decades and decades, and we can say a century old. And how do you address those issues? And it's funny to say that, but when I was going to elementary, my school was predominantly Jewish. And every year we went to the Museum of Tolerance. Their history was taught to them. They were told not to forget it. But in the same school, you know, when I remember looking in a history book, when you look for African American history, I'm looking at just 2 pages. I'm looking at Martin Luther King on one page, taking up a blurb and part of the other page, and then Malcolm X on the other page, and then you turn the page and that's it. So having those conversations, teaching that history, not shying away from it. It's an ugly truth. We know that it's that it's there. I just need everybody else to have an open mind and to acknowledge the fact that it's there, and we can just talk about it. I think that is a start. That is 50% of the battle. That is what we call showing up.
Roderick?
Yeah, so for me, like I mentioned, because our organization is not like a, you know, direct aid type of organization, that fundamentally, you know, changes to a certain point what like direct aid or what solidarity looks like for us. So one thing that I have mentioned with our managing director that I'm really excited about is, you know, figuring out a way in our newsletter or somehow to give like a weekly spotlight to a direct aid organization, in particular those working in the housing space. Because I think, you know, even if we aren't going to do direct, if our role in this, you know, in all of this work isn't direct aid, that's okay. But we still need to show solidarity. We still need to show up and figure out a way to help folks. And so if that is as simple as like something as simple as, like I said, showing a weekly spotlight on a different group to wake up our volunteers and members to what's happening directly on the ground and to give them that exposure much more intimately, then that is at least something we can do. especially as it relates to equity and racial justice, because like I think I always do my best learning when I am around people who do direct aid, because I'm like, wow, this is like legit happening right now on the ground. And I may be unaware of that, right? Because unfortunately, we can't all know everything. But that is the way that and I'm still trying to figure out other ways to figure out how we can support and show solidarity with direct aid organizations. Because like I said, and what I've talked about with folks, it's like when all of this stuff happened, as an individual, I felt like useless, right? In my role, I was kind of like, cool, like I have my role, is great. But like people are quite literally dying right now. And I'm doing a job where I feel useless to the greater community, because I think like it's intrinsic in a lot of us to want to help our direct communities, whatever that looks like. But helping, and so at least in that sense, but I do think what I like about what Susan and Zarita is doing is like the strength in numbers, right? Like you can buy food and stuff in bulk, and just when you got low income Black folks and who are seniors, or low income Korean Americans or Asian Americans who are seniors, buying in bulk helps, just helps get more for more people. And so like seeing things like that to me is aspirational. But for me, it's always about, like I said, as a person not working directly in direct aid, trying to figure out and learn, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of that out in society, how organizations who are not doing direct aid can show up for those who are. Because right now, and what we saw over the past few months is that is what became important, and we still need to honor that.
Thank you so much, Roderick. So I just want to thank everybody for this panel and this conversation. I think it was truly powerful to hear the words of folks as they talked about our histories and sort of how you build partnership, understanding histories, experiences, how experiences can be different but can also be similar, how conversations help build trust, how trust is key and trust is built over time and is built over action, how showing up and supporting is important, right? COVID-19 showed us that there was a system that had forgotten about all of us that are not rich and as part of the elite class, but it was us and it was people like all of us on this call that showed up and really provided aid for our communities in need that have been historically abandoned. It's really about, I heard about the challenging the norms, right? Not allowing for the status quo to exist. So in closing, I really want folks to hear those words, hear that passion, hear those stories that we heard from everyone as we talked about mutual aid and how mutual aid came about and sort of from these specific examples in our organizations in Los Angeles. I'm going to pivot. I'm going to thank everybody who's on the panel, and I'm going to pivot back to Zoe to sort of close it out. I think I messed up her name. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. Sue.
Sue, sorry, excuse me.
No, it's happens all the time. Yeah, our hearts are bursting, our spirits are high, and our minds are buzzing from this talk. Thank you so much, Susan and Zarita and Sissy, Roderick and Steve, for sharing your experiences and insights with us. We're also grateful for our GEOPO team, committee members who helped us make this program possible. Shout outs to Grace, Eugene, Nancy, Allison, Christine, Gina, Roger, Aileen, Kayla, Bora, Kat, and Allie, as well as the ASL interpreters. It takes a village, and GEOPO is a fun one. We are a volunteer-run nonprofit organization, so if any of you are interested in working with us, please be in touch at info@geopo.us. Thank you so much, everybody, for this great talk today.